As international attention remains firmly focused on Gaza and Ukraine, fears are growing about the deteriorating situation in Sudan. Racked by a fierce civil war that's escalated dramatically over the course of the past year, the country is rapidly becoming the world's worst humanitarian crisis. But while millions have been displaced and many millions more are now facing starvation, many observers are now calling it a forgotten war. So, what exactly is happening in Sudan, and why is urgent action so desperately needed? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security and statehood. Why do some conflicts receive widespread international attention and yet others don't? This is a question that many observers of international relations often ask. Sometimes it might be because a situation touches on geopolitical factors or directly involves a great power or one of its close allies. At other times it may have economic effects, such as disrupting trade routes or access to vital resources, or it may be because it threatens to spread, becoming a regional or even international war. Of course, media and policy priorities also play a role. Wars in more remote or less strategically significant areas naturally receive less attention, even if their effects are far more catastrophic than other conflicts. Meanwhile, sometimes a conflict that initially attracts widespread news coverage will disappear almost entirely from the news agenda. Sudan is an excellent case in point. While international attention is focused on the conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, the country is becoming the world's worst humanitarian disaster. And yet, while the outbreak of the civil war received considerable media coverage, the situation is now receiving next to no international attention. The Republic of Sudan is in northeast Africa. Covering 1.8 million square kilometres or 720,000 square miles, it's the world's 15th largest country. The Red Sea runs along its eastern coast, and to its east is Eritrea. Ethiopia and South Sudan are to its south, and the Central African Republic, Chad and Libya are to its west. Egypt lies to its north. The population is believed to be around 46 million. Although almost all Sudanese are Sunni Muslims, the country is ethnically mixed. While the majority are Arab, around a third of the population comprise Sub-Saharan African groups. Sudan's history stretches back thousands of years. Once dominated by ancient Egypt, it later came under Christian Nubian rule. However, by the 17th century, Islam had gained a foothold over the northern regions. In the early 19th century, the Ottoman Empire and its Egyptian vassal state successfully expanded their reach into Sudan. This lasted until 1881, when a revolt erupted under a local Muslim religious leader. Concerned about the effects on the newly built Suez Canal and fearing it could spread more widely, Britain then stepped in to quell the uprising. Under British colonial rule, steps were taken to integrate the predominantly Arab Muslim northern provinces, which comprised most of the population, with the southern provinces consisting of Sub-Saharan African tribes following Christianity and local faiths. However, as decolonisation took off after the Second World War, deep divisions erupted over Sudan's future. While the South was willing to accept a united Sudanese state, it wanted a federal structure. Otherwise, it called for independence, a position that was fiercely opposed by the Muslim Arab North. Matters all came to a head in July 1955 when southern troops serving in the colonial armed forces mutinied. As the violence spread, Britain quickly decided that it couldn't control the situation, and 6 months later, on the 1st of January 1956, Sudan gained its independence. From the start, the country was plunged into a bitter and brutal civil war. This lasted until 1972, when the sides agreed on a peace deal that gave the South considerable self-rule. But any hopes of a lasting settlement were short-lived. Following the discovery of oil deposits along the north-south boundary, the northern-led central government revoked the agreement, imposing direct rule, including Islamic law, on the southern areas. This sparked a second civil war as the southern-led Sudan People's Liberation Army, the SPLA, supported by neighbouring Ethiopia, seized control of much of the south. By the end of the 1980s, the civil war in Sudan had become Africa's longest-running conflict. In 1989, the Sudanese army staged a coup, imposing a dictatorship under Colonel Omar al Bashir. But despite hopes that this would turn the tide of the war in the North's favour, the SPLA retained control over large parts of the south. By the turn of the millennium, the North was coming under increasing pressure. Aside from almost 50 years of continuous war with the South that had left 2 million dead, a brutal new conflict was emerging in the west of the country, in a region known as Darfur. On top of this, following the 9/11 attacks, Washington began to focus on Bashir, who was accused of supporting Islamist terrorism. In January 2005, following US-led talks, Bashir agreed to a peace deal that would eventually open the way for southern independence 6 years later. But while the question of the south had finally been resolved, the situation in Darfur continued to deteriorate as a violent Arab militia known as the Janjaweed waged a campaign of genocide and ethnic cleansing against the Sub-Saharan African groups in the region. With Bashir facing charges of crimes against humanity, the feared Janjaweed was eventually placed under the control of the army, becoming known as the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. While it may have seemed that Sudan was now on the path of peace, other problems were emerging. Having lost significant oil revenues when the South became independent, the government had been forced to reduce its spending, thereby sparking widespread opposition to the ruling regime. Following massive street protests, the military eventually stepped in. After 30 years in power, Bashir was ousted in April 2019. Although there were hopes that this would open the way for democracy, the military tried to hold on to power. However, following considerable international pressure, they agreed to a power-sharing transitional council. Alongside a civilian prime minister, this body included the Armed Forces commander, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and his deputy, General Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, the RSF commander. But all this wasn't enough to quell the popular calls for democracy. Facing further protests, the military staged another coup on the 25th of October 2021. After abolishing the Transitional Council and arresting the civilian Prime Minister, Burhan and Dagalo retook control of the country. Although the two generals had close ties stretching back to the conflict in Darfur, tensions soon grew between them. While Burhan enjoyed the support of the northern elites, Dagalo, who came from Darfur, was viewed with contempt and suspicion. He was also tainted by allegations of corruption and sleaze after it emerged that he'd seized control of various gold mines in Darfur. Facing such high-level opposition, and in an attempt to build up his power base, Dagalo now reinvented himself as a political figure, courting popular support. Calling the coup a mistake, he accused Burhan of being a radical Islamist. Meanwhile, both men also sought to build up their international support. While Burhan fostered relations with Washington and the West, Dagalo established close ties with Moscow. In the end, the growing power struggle between the two men erupted on the 15th of April 2023 when clashes broke out between the army and the RSF. Over the next few days and weeks, these escalated rapidly, and as the number of casualties shot up, tens of thousands began to flee the country's capital, Khartoum. At first, the fighting in Sudan attracted considerable international attention, not least of all because of the large number of foreigners who were working in the country and found themselves caught in the deteriorating situation. This in turn forced many countries, including the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Saudi Arabia and India, amongst many others, to send military forces to carry out urgent evacuations. However, there were also broader political and strategic factors at play. For instance, the country's position on the Red Sea, one of the world's most important waterways, also attracted attention, as did its traditional position as a conduit between North and Sub-Saharan Africa. Finally, the factional links to Russia and the West also gave the fighting an international policy and media dimension. As a result, considerable efforts were made over the following weeks to try to resolve the situation, with frequent calls for ceasefires and peace talks. But despite widespread calls for calm and dialogue, the conflict continued. Despite the initial burst of attention, media coverage soon drifted. Once the foreigners were out, news of the conflict soon dwindled. Likewise, policy attention turned elsewhere, especially after the surge in Middle East violence following Hamas's attack on Israel 5 months later in October 2023. However, while there's now little international focus on Sudan, the situation on the ground has continued to worsen. In addition to the ongoing battles in the capital, the fighting spread to other parts of the country as the RSF seem to be making significant gains. More recently, calls for a ceasefire to mark the Muslim holy month of Ramadan have gone unheeded as the army seeks to capitalise on recent gains against the RSF. Indeed, news has recently broken that the army has managed to retake control of the state broadcaster, which was lost in the first few days of the war. To make matters worse, the conflict has also become a strange proxy war between Russia and Ukraine, as members of the Russian Wagner group enlisted by Dagalo are fighting Ukrainian commandos supporting the army. While the civil war continues to take its toll, with at least 14,000 killed and tens of thousands wounded in the fighting, it's the broader effects of the conflict that are now giving the greatest cause for concern. While the number of internally displaced persons, IDPs, is estimated to be around 6.3 million, Sudan is now believed to have the highest number of IDPs in the world. On top of this, 1.7 million are believed to have fled the country, becoming refugees in neighbouring states. But it's the serious food shortages that are proving particularly worrying. With the almost complete breakdown of law and order and essential government services, the country now stands on the brink of starvation. Indeed, altogether, the United Nations estimates that around half the country's population, approximately 25 million people, now need life-saving assistance, including 14 million children. Looking ahead, these figures are set to grow in the months ahead. Meanwhile, other factors have also made the situation even worse. For example, the growing attacks on Red Sea shipping by Houthi forces in nearby Yemen have severely curtailed the number of ships able to make it to Port Sudan, the country's main outlet to the sea. This has limited food from coming in. In addition, the wider region has faced severe famines in recent years, which have led to lingering food shortages. All this means that on top of the vicious civil war that shows no sign of letting up, Sudan is now on course to become the world's worst hunger crisis. And if this were not enough, there are also growing fears about the worsening situation in Darfur, where horrific acts of violence are now being reported. And yet, with the conflict about to enter its second year, and the UN now calling for $4.1 billion to help deal with the crisis, the organisation's Under-Secretary General, Martin Griffiths, has noted that it's been extraordinarily difficult to get the international community to focus on Sudan. The tragic reality is that with international attention still firmly focused on Gaza and Ukraine, the world is paying precious little attention to this vast unfolding disaster in Africa. I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.